Well, greetings, fellow thinkers and drinkers, and welcome to this fourth and final video examining Dio's association with Black Sabbath. Across this series, as taken association with the band, taken it under a slightly more critical lens, perhaps. I know in some quarters it has been an association which has taken on the status of a sacred cow. Last time we left the story in the aftermath of the Dehumanizer episode. More specifically, the messy and rather undignified collapse of what was in many ways an ill-conceived project. The fallout was predictably damaging, pushing both Dio and Sabbath, further towards, I think musical irrelevance is perhaps a little overstating it, but certainly in terms of commercial performance and public appeal, they both took a step back post-Dehumanizer. Dio returned to his solo career, releasing 5 albums between 1993 and 2004. Initially, these continued the heavier, more abrasive direction featured on Dehumanizer, before gradually reverting to the more familiar formula of fantasy-driven themes, long associated with him. Not the place to assess those in detail, but again, I think it is worth noting that they were met with increasing public indifference. And by 2004, he was effectively playing clubs, especially in the States, to his core audience. But in fairness, one should mention that he always retained enough of a core audience, to justify his career, shall we say. But commercially, his career was at something of a low ebb. Sabbath, meanwhile, post-Dehumanizer, returned to Tony Martin and released 2 further albums, which were met with even less enthusiasm. The predicted damage to their credibility following the aborted Dio reunion, as previously discussed, had clearly taken its toll, which is a pity, as there is worthwhile material to be found on both, and certainly live. Sabbath were pretty good around this time. Well, once again, however, instability plagued the band's both albums, featuring different lineups, and the revolving door of personnel had returned in earnest. You may get away with this. It may even be expected in something of a solo venture, such as Dio's, but for what should be an established band, and we've discussed this before, such as Black Sabbath, it just simply reinforced the sense of drift. Now, as it happens, Sabbath played their final show with Tony Martin in December 1995. Iommi then effectively placed the band on hold, although without any formal announcement to that effect. Indeed, perhaps mindful of past criticism regarding instability, he continued throughout 1996 to insist that Tony Martin remained part of the band. This would later go on to prove to have been somewhat disingenuous. At the time, rumors began to circulate. At one point, Rob Halford was linked to the band, and thankfully, this came to nothing. More concretely, the late Steve Grimmett of Grim Reaper had in fact auditioned and been offered the role of Sabbath's new vocalist, replacing Tony Martin. Grimmett himself believed that he had secured the position until, that is, he saw an announcement on MTV for a 1997 summer tour. That, of course, was the Black Sabbath tour, featuring Butler, Iommi, and Osbourne, and this marked the beginning of the reunion of the original lineup. By the end of 1997, Bill Ward had also rejoined, largely due to public demand and in response to the rather questionable decision to exclude him initially. This reformed lineup would spend the next several years, up until and including 2005, touring pretty extensively, most notably through the Ozfest in the United States, but they also visited other markets. And commercially and critically, this was a huge success. Artistically, however, it was something of a different story. Osbourne's vocal limitations imposed a narrow and increasingly repetitive setlist, leaving little room for either variation or ambition. And what initially felt like a triumphant return soon revealed itself to be little more than a nostalgia exercise, sustained by reputation rather than creativity. So, once the initial euphoria had faded, the performances settled into a predictable routine. Competent, certainly, but devoid of risk, evolution, or genuine inspiration. For all its commercial and critical success, this was a version of Black Sabbath looking backwards rather than forwards. That being said, in 2001, the original lineup did attempt to write and record new material, with Rick Rubin being brought in to oversee the sessions. What we subsequently know, although I suppose we guessed at the time, was the results were simply not underwhelming. They were also quite revealing. The process apparently lacked direction, cohesion, and most tellingly, any real sense of creative urgency. It was as though the band had, reunited in name, no longer possessed the creative spark that had once defined them. Very little of substance apparently emerged. We did get the one song, Scary Dreams, good God, which they did play live, but, if that was anything to go by, and apparently that was what they considered the best result, well, I suppose it speaks for itself. It was by the numbers, shall we say. And the rest of it, by common consent, fell well below the standard one might reasonably expect, so... Far from signaling a creative rebirth, these sessions suggested that, the band had, to all intents and purposes, or the creative well had all intents and purposes run dry, and thus the project came to nothing. Then around 2006, a couple of things happened. Iommi, by this stage, with his finances comfortably replenished, and his reputation long since assured, began, I think, to feel, an increasing sense of creative restlessness. Around the same time, the record company set in motion one of the more predictable exercises in catalogue exploitation, that of a compilation album focused on the Dio years. To their credit, however, they did at least ask whether any unreleased material might be drawn from the archives, a rare attempt to offer something of genuine interest rather than simply repackaging the familiar. Now, as is well known, such material does exist. Indeed, in the second video on this series, I discussed it while discussing, the Mob Rules album. However, in typically guarded fashion, Iommi showed little enthusiasm for opening the vaults. Instead, he chose a different route. He approached Dio with the suggestion that they record new material specifically for this release. Dio responded with enthusiasm, and the two began working together, largely, it seems, to the exclusion of anyone else. The outcome, I think, was rather telling. Rather than the token track often appended to such compilations, the sessions yielded 3 new songs, all of which found their way onto Black Sabbath The Dio Years, which was released in 2007. Now, what had begun as a routine compilation project was, at least in part, becoming something rather more significant. The 3 new tracks that were included on the Black Sabbath The Dio Years compilation, The Devil Cried, Shadow of the Wind, and Ear in the Wall, represents a conscious attempt, I think, to reconnect with the established Dio era sound. Well, I suppose they did also reflect, in some ways, passage of time and production values. The Devil Cried, perhaps, is the most immediately accessible of the 3. It's built around a steady mid-tempo riff. It leans heavily towards a more melodic and structured approach associated, I think, with the Heaven and Hell era material, chorus is strong, it's clearly defined, Dio's vocal performance is commanding, controlled, and assured. In compositional terms, it feels closest to the band's earlier work, favouring clarity and balance, certainly over experimentation. And while effective, it does not significantly expand on what the band had established in the 1980s. Shadow of the Wind adopts a slower, heavier approach, drawing more directly from the darker, more oppressive, ominous atmosphere of Dehumanizer. The riff is weightier and overall tone much more brooding, though it does not quite match the intensity of some or the majority of that album. There's a deliberate sense of restraint in the arrangement, however. It does allow the track to build and breathe and develop gradually. And it is perhaps the most cohesive of the three, successfully blending the elements of both the earlier Dio phases. Ear in the Wall was the most aggressive and direct of the trio, faster paced, riff-driven, carries echoes of the band's heavier material, though its structure is more straightforward and less layered. Song relies on momentum and energy rather than atmosphere, and while it's effective in that regard, it perhaps lacks some of the depth and nuance found in the strongest Dio-era compositions. Taken together, these tracks do not attempt to reinvent the band's sound, by no way, no stretch of the imagination. Instead, they consolidate familiar elements from across the Dio years. Melodic structure, heavy riffing, darker tonal themes, but again, produced in a more modern feel to it, I suppose, which reflected what was going on in 2006, 2007. They're competently executed, and at times they are genuinely engaging, though they largely reaffirm rather than redefine the musical identity established on their earlier collaborations. That being said, the material proves strong enough to generate renewed interest both amongst the fans and within the industry. Indeed, the response was sufficiently positive that the idea of touring behind the release was soon proposed. Initially, there were plans for Geezer Butler and Bill Ward to join the project, which would have obviously provided a clear link back to the Heaven and Hell era and, in effect, constituted yet another Black Sabbath reunion. In the event, however, Ward withdrew, citing musical differences with certain of his colleagues. Look, Bill Ward's on-off relationship with Black Sabbath is a subject worthy of a separate discussion, and one we may well have. But at the time, there were concerns about his ability to undertake a full touring schedule. Not for the last time. Be that as it may, he stepped aside and Vinny Appice was quickly brought in as his replacement. This effectively reconstituted the Mob Rules lineup for a second time. Well, third time, I suppose. However, at this point, matters took a more contentious turn. Clearly less than impressed that Iommi and Sabbath were preparing to tour without the involvement of her husband, Mrs. Osbourne decided to intervene. Without wishing to delve too deeply into the legal background behind all this, by this point the rights to the Black Sabbath name were effectively shared between Iommi and the Osbourne camp, meaning that she was, I suppose, well within her rights to object. Nevertheless, the manner of the intervention once again demonstrated her utter contempt for the fans. The practical outcome, however, was fairly straightforward. This new venture could not proceed under the name Black Sabbath. So, instead, they adopted the band name Heaven and Hell. Inadvertently, one suspects, and I would emphasize that, Mrs. Osbourne's decision actually did the project a considerable favor. By establishing its own distinct identity, the band were able to stand on their own terms, and rather rather than yet another iteration of Black Sabbath, although for all intents and purposes that's what it was. In practical terms, this freed them from the burden of performing Osbourne-era material live, something that had long been a source of tension and contention. And again, as I've said, as events would go on to prove, this proved to be a significant advantage for the project. A little brief aside here. It would appear by this point in time, this point in their careers, all concerned had set aside their personal differences. A belated intrusion of maturity, perhaps. We do not know, as we are not privy to their. We're not part of their inner circle. But the fact remains that for the remainder of their time together, past jealousies and petty arguments appear to have been buried. And what emerged was a genuine friendship and a mutually appreciative working relationship within the band. And this, I would suggest, is something to be celebrated. Fortunately, their sold-out show at the Radio City Music Hall in New York was recorded for posterity in both video and audio form. The only slight downside was that due to certain filming restrictions, can't remember the details, but never mind, it was down to timing or something, so they decided to drop one of the new songs that they had been playing live, namely Ear in the Wall. So it was omitted from this show, and sadly, it was never to return. Now, if this performance is anything to go by, one need not ask why the tour was such a resounding success. Everyone on stage is manifestly enjoying themselves, and the audience is thoroughly enthralled. And I think for Tony Iommi and Geezer Butler in particular, the sheer joy of not having to play War Pigs at Iron Man once again, songs they could have performed in their sleep after a decade of repetition, is equally palpable. In terms of material, they now had 3 new songs, 2 new songs, alongside 3 albums worth of material to draw from. So what did we get? Well, E5150 once again provides the taped introduction before they launch into After All, the Dead. Now, this is a brave and inspired choice, I maintain. It's slow, it's unbelievably heavy, and it does set the scene perfectly for what is to come. Spotlight on Iommi, he engages in the riff, and then Dio appears on cue and delivers that great opening line, what do I say to the dead? It is a wonderfully dramatic moment. As I said, it really sets up the entire show. They follow it up with the more high-octane Mob Rules. Now, ordinarily, these would have been performed in the opposite order. Most bands start their shows with the up-tempo hard rocker, but I think credit is very much due to the band here for attempting something different. Children of the Sea follows, which is as majestic as ever it was. They then play Lady Evil, and I suppose it comes across all right, but it does remain a weak song. And I think, especially at this point and this point only, it would have been nice for them to do something, maybe something they hadn't done before, so Wishing Well or something. At least, it had some drive to it. The Sign of the Southern Cross and Voodoo maintain the momentum in fine style. And then the first new song, The Devil Cried, more than holds its own against its more familiar counterparts. Computer God, and especially Falling Off the Edge of the World, are immense. The latter, played for the first time since those handful of dates in 1982, proves its enduring strength and again raises the question, why had it been absent in the interim? The second new song, Shadow of the Wind, once again proves to be a strong live contender, and Die Young in Heaven and Hell more than live up to their reputations. Thankfully, they had reintroduced the sublime "lonely as the word," again for the first time since the early days of the Heaven and Hell tour, and again one is left wondering why they dropped it back in the day, especially for Lady Evil. But hey, it's back, and we can celebrate its return. And then Neon Nights closes the show in particularly fine style. A superb performance. Everyone is in top form, and the enthusiasm is unmistakable. And it's remarkable to point out, I think, how well Dio's voice had held up. I mean, he was in his early to mid-60s by this point. And I suppose, it would, equally true to say he wasn't quite as he was in his prime, but by the same token, any criticisms would be pedantic in the extreme. The tour was, as I said, and quite rightly, a resounding success. Okay, a couple of observations. Apart from the 2 new tracks, no previously unplayed material was aired, which means no Wishing Well, Walk Away, or Over and Over, or for that matter, no Letters from Earth, Sins of the Father, Too Late, or Buried Alive. And again, one could, I suppose, argue that, Mob Rules was a little underrepresented in the show. And again, one harks back to a point I made in the other video that the band do seem, still to retain a certain dissatisfaction with that album. Well, they then did what they initially said they would not do, but after the obvious success of the tour, I think it became inevitable that they decided to record a new album together, which emerged in 2009 as The Devil You Know, which, it must be said, along with the live release we've just discussed, performed pretty damn well commercially. I mean, okay, all things are relative to 2009, however, none of them were million sellers, but, in commercial terms, maybe they exceeded expectations, I don't know, but they were certainly very successful. Well, The Devil You Know is, at the time, and I suppose remains, a solid, and professionally delivered album. Well, it does include a handful of standout tracks. However, it suffers to some extent from a lack of clear creative direction, I feel. Too often the material leans on heavy, slow, doomy structures that fail to develop, certainly as they once did, or the songs don't really resolve with any real sense of purpose or progression, leaving several tracks feeling static rather than immersive. Point here is, I think what brings this home, one of Dio's defining strengths, and it's particularly evident in his solo work, was his ability to craft engaging and compelling vocal melodies, even over relatively average backing tracks. You can think of, some songs on Sacred Heart or something like that towards the end, not great compositions, but Dio's did enough to elevate them. Yet here that instinct is applied inconsistently, to say the least. Something that had become apparent, I should say, on his later solo efforts from Magica, at least, onwards. Though I was not aware of that at the time, having largely lost touch with his output post-Dehumanizer. It was only after I became familiar with The Devil You Know that I actually went back and checked out his later solo career. But you can see the pattern. A lot of these criticisms, I think, do apply to especially Magica, which, with one or two exceptions, I always felt had, profound soporific qualities. And at times on this album, The Devil You Know, the vocal lines feel less inspired, and they do lack that melodic lift that might otherwise have elevated the material. And as a result, the songs rely Too much on atmosphere that's not always apparent, rather than on memorable vocal or compositional hooks. I think there's also very much a sense that the band performing under the Heaven and Hell banner were perhaps too conscious of expectations, and perhaps leaned too heavily into delivering what their reputation suggested, or perhaps, they pandered to the crowd rather more than they should, rather than pursuing any genuine evolution in their sound. I guess that's all understandable enough, but I think resultingly the outcome can feel somewhat constrained. That said, the album is by no means a failure. It's competently performed, very well produced by the band, I think, itself. It's not overly compressed, a production. It's heavy, it resonates, it's dense. Perhaps one could argue a little more separation of instrument might have helped, but nothing about it ever descends into embarrassment. However, as I said, it does lack the spark that would have made it truly memorable. And in retrospect, I do not think it has aged well. Stands as a respectable but ultimately conservative entry in the Black Sabbath catalogue, despite what it says. Despite the name of the band, this is unmistakably Black Sabbath. But it does, again, I have to say, lack that sense of daring, shall we say, that defined the band's best work. Not the first time that observation has been made when addressing the Dio-fronted material. In terms of the actual songs, I think Bible Black, Neverwhere, and Breaking into Heaven are the obvious standouts, and they are all three worthy of comparison to their previous efforts. Atom and Evil, Fear, Follow the Tears are also very strong contenders, and perhaps not quite at the level of the other three. But Double the Pain, Rock and Roll Angel, and Turn of the Screw fall a little flat, and they fall a little flat along the terms that I have just described. They plod, or they grind along well enough, but they have few distinctive features. And again, in particular, when it comes to the vocal melodies and musical hooks. The other track, Eating the Cannibals, does have pace and energy, no doubt, but I have to say, the lyrics are absolutely risible. Not to Dio's finest effort. But what was to one expect? I mean, realistically, by this point in their career, they were all elder statesmen. And, again, nobody, I don't think, reasonably expected a genre-redefining effort. No, but what they delivered instead is a solid, dependable release, one that, with the exception of the Heaven and Hell album, sits squarely, to the mid to lower tier of Black Sabbath catalogue. And this is entirely consistent with the rest of the Dio-fronted output in the band's career. It's competent as assured, but it rarely pushing beyond established boundaries. Despite what it says on the tin, as I've already alluded to, this is still Black Sabbath, recognizably so. But it is a point where it is Black Sabbath, it's a point in being Black Sabbath where legacy takes precedence over reinvention. The inevitable tour followed, and that was captured on the Live at Wacken 30 Years of Heaven and Hell video and CD release. Now, I caught this tour here in Berlin, and it was indeed a curious experience, seeing them playing in daylight at an open-air summer show. It was, however, nonetheless, another superb and memorable performance. But let's make a few observations. The set was noticeably shorter than it had been on the Live at the Radio City Music Hall release, and only 3 of the new songs from The Devil You Know were included, and of the other sort of new material from the compilation album, well, they'd all been dropped. The excellent Bible Black quickly establishes itself as an instant live classic, but I'm afraid the inclusion of Fear and Follow the Tears did little to sustain the momentum, and that comes back to the criticisms I made of the studio versions of of those songs. And while neither of them were the worst offenders on The Devil they didn't have that something that translated into compelling live renditions. And I still maintain, in contrast, Neverwhere and Breaking into Heaven would have been far, far stronger choices. Similarly, as has been mentioned often, beyond the title track and Falling Off the Edge of the World, material from the Mob Rules was once again, conspicuous by its absence. And there was a distinct feeling at the time that the Settlers had settled into a more conservative shape. And I go back here to the comments I made about the Osbourne reunion that preceded, this venture. That after the initial euphoria of the reunion had worn off, that they started playing it very safe again. And there's a distinct feeling that history was about to repeat itself, because the opportunity was there. They did have the opportunity to introduce previously unplayed material. I've already mentioned Wishing Well, Walk Away, Over and Over, Letters from Earth, etc., or to put greater emphasis on the newer songs. Only 3 were included. Could have had they could have made it 5 or something like that, and I still maintain, something with the energy of Neverwhere or something with the absolute class of Breaking into Heaven. One would have thought were very obvious choices. The opportunity was there, but for some reason, not fully taken. Those were my thoughts at the time, but what obviously not aware of, while attending this concert, something we didn't know at the time was that Dio was already in declining health. However, his show must go on attitude meant that he refused to disappoint the fans, and thus the tour continued. In retrospect, he may have benefited from seeking medical advice earlier. Well, as it transpired, and as we all now know, he was suffering from cancer, which sadly claimed his life in May 2010, and thus bringing the project to an end. What then to say in summary? How does the conventional wisdom regarding Dio's impact on Black Sabbath and truly stand up? Well, it was a tumultuous journey, wasn't it? Certainly not devoid of drama or interest. And a journey that ultimately spanned 30 years. Yet the reality is, of those 30 years, they spent about 8, certainly less than 10, actually actively together. Now, I've said before, all my comments, criticisms should be seen and taken as insular. They relate strictly to the band itself. No comparison is made to other artists, and I'll admit it. Now, if given the choice between Dio era Sabbath, just in case you think I have been too harsh on it, if given the choice between Dio era Sabbath and the vast majority of other bands out there, I would still choose to listen to Dio era Sabbath without too much hesitation. However, it does remain the case that, with the exception of much of Heaven and Hell, and the odd track here and there afterwards, I find that the band produced more interesting, challenging, and engaging music with other singers. It's also evident that, until the later Heaven and Hell period, Tony Iommi generally experienced much less strained, and I would say arguably more productive, working relationships with some of those other vocalists. But these are all conversations for another time. From a career standpoint, one may well argue that had Dio and Iommi established their later working relationship earlier, both parties would have enjoyed greater stability and more consistent output and arguably more sustained success. I'm talking particularly here about had they stayed together throughout the 80s. Though conceivably, one could also say had the Dehumanizer reunion lasted for several additional albums and tours. Yet, again, as I have argued, this may well have come at the cost of those very qualities that made Sabbath's music so compelling in the first place. One may argue that Dio did his best work with Rainbow, where he genuinely did help create and define a genre, as opposed to his work with Sabbath, where the band too often, under his stewardship, appeared to be following trends established by others. And equally, one has to say, both of Dio's departures from the band inflicted real damage on Sabbath's continuity, direction, reputation, and public standing. And while, their collaboration may ultimately have gone out on something of a high with Heaven and Hell, at least in terms of being, a compelling live act, one could again argue that by this time it hardly mattered, certainly not in career terms. Though on a personal level, I think it was rewarding for all concerned to have eventually put their past problems behind them and finish on a united and thoroughly enjoyable and affirming note. However, in summary, none of this can outweigh the broader consequences of their previous associations. And ultimately, when the full balance is considered, the Dio collaborations tip more towards the negative than the positive. And this is not least because the damage caused by his departures, at precisely the moments where continuity and stability mattered most in career terms. Well, those are my thoughts. So, please feel free to like, to subscribe, share, and all those good things, and obviously to comment. I'm sure this is not the prevailing view, so I'd like to hear what other people think. And I've tried to be as objective over these last four videos as I can, and again, this is all taken as it's taken as various phases, episodes in the band's entire career, and the effect these collaborations had on the band. So, on those terms, I once again thank you very much for your indulgence. I wish you well, and until next time, my Shonker.